that was in a little village called Lonjovice, and probably the nicest time in my childhood. I was the only Jew in the whole village, anyhow. Besides my brothers, you went to school with the boys. They went to your house. You went to their house. We went graze the geese and the goats and all that. And I really didn't have any bad feelings about being Jewish or any bad rap from my buddies at that time. This did develop though later on during the in the beginning of the war. There was one with a German name. Became a member of the Nazi Party. In 1938, we had this armament by the Czech army. I mean, everybody was mobilized because the Germans were on the border. This is 1938, 1939, and they were sent toward the borders to protect the country, but of course there was no way that they could protect. It was like 50 to 1 shot. There was no way. That's when I realized that we were getting into some war, a warlike element, I guess. I know that my father was involved in some political doings. How much, I really don't know. But I know that he was taken prisoner when he listened and got convicted of listening to a foreign radio, possibly the BBC, which was strictly prohibited. There was a talk of an espionage, but I really don't know what happened at the time. All I know that he was taken to a concentration camp in Mauthausen, which is not too far from Vienna, Austria, and he died in the concentration camp in 1942. And there are two stories on how he died. One of them is that when he was taken, he did not let the Germans believe that he was Jewish, which of course they found out later on. And they supposedly have sent him to the electric wires, which protects the camp, or protects the holds the prisoners in so they cannot escape. The other story is that he actually committed suicide. And we were never able to determine which was the true story. Now my mother was not in the concentration camp because her father was some sort of a big hero in the First World War. And they didn't drag her in. So that was a good fortune. But during the Hitler time, you weren't allowed to leave the country. My sister could because she was an American citizen, and it didn't make any difference of the religion. When you're an American, it doesn't make that much of a difference. As a matter of fact, she was summoned by the American consulate in Prague, stating you're an American citizen. If you want to go to the United States, you have to leave now. Otherwise, we cannot take responsibility for you. My mother and grandmother got together. The fare had to be paid in dollars. Grandma got the money. My sister came here in 1941. I really wasn't arrested. I was requested or told to report, and I did. And this happened in June 1944. And I went to a ghetto, the Terezin Lager, Terezinstadt, or Terezin, whichever way you want to. And when I got there, I came at the tail end of a transport that was being shipped to Auschwitz and Birkenau. I had hoped to see my uncle, my aunt, and my cousins, but never had the chance. They were gone. They went to Auschwitz and never to be heard from again. So that part of the family just, I had some second cousins and so forth, but these were the closest family. They were my true cousins and true uncle and true aunt. Never seen them again. So that was that. When they sent us to the ghetto, to the Terezin ghetto, or there were other ghettos around, Warsaw ghetto really had it bad in comparisons to the Terezin ghetto. And when you put 160, 170,000 people into a small village, and you can't observe anymore, you have to send them out. And slave labor is the cheapest labor there is. And the Germans took advantage of that. Don't forget that Terezin was guarded by the Czech gendarmes, which is like a sheriff's department here. You have police and gendarmes. So it would, and they were certainly not gracious to us, but they certainly were not nowhere near as abusive to us as the Germans were later on in the concentration camps. And you also had the prisoners were actually abusive to one another, especially if you had if you were like a foreman or a capo, which means head in Italian. And yeah, they were pretty abusive. There were a few good times, but mostly they were bad times, you know. The last transport from Terezin to Auschwitz, October 28, 1944. And we were put into these wagons. There must have been 50, 60, maybe more than that of us in these wagon apiece. Young people, old people, men, women. And even the windows were wired and shut. It took about 3 days. I believe it was November 1st when we came to Auschwitz. It was in the evening, and it wasn't very sanitary. There was no bathrooms or anything like that for 3 days, so you can imagine. When the doors were opened, we got off on the wagons, and as we walked maybe less than 10 yards, there was a German soldier, and first of all he felt our arms. And then the next soldier, probably an officer, don't really remember that well, had a pair of gloves in his hand, and he was going this way or that way. That way, he went to the gas chamber. Of course, we didn't know that. This way, you survived. You didn't go into the gas chamber. And the first time that I really thought was really terrible was when they marched us in between these camps, these barracks on the road, all wires. And I saw a prisoner. This was 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. He was cornered by a German Shepherd dog, which was on a leash, by a female soldier. And she actually sicked the dog onto this poor man who was, and they just marched us by, so I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened to him. They marched us into what was called a sauna, maybe 500, 600 men at the time, boys, but male, all males. We were to strip naked. The first room, as we walked in, was a large room with showers, and 2 or 3 of us shared a shower. They shaved us, cut the hair off, every bit of hair we had on us. They shaved and put some disinfectant or whatever. I don't remember what it was exactly. All I remember was the color was greenish black. And we took a shower again. And then when we went through this, they gave us some clothes. They were clean and wooden shoes, and the bottoms were wood. And we put these on, and they marched us outside. And I remember seeing a lot of ice. The puddles of water were frozen over, and we were cold. I mean, we were cold. We hadn't had anything to eat for a couple, 3 days now. And they separated us. I was 14 at the time. They separated us from the adults, and they marched us into a camp. It was Lager A, which up until that time was a family lager. But when we got there, the families were already broken up. It was cleared up. So we spent the night there, and the following morning, we got our tattoos, our numbers, like this. transport, they gassed more than a half of the transport right there and then when we got to Auschwitz. We didn't know, but the stench was just terrible. And you know, like when you burn hair, that's how it was. And 3 days later, it was worse because they gassed the whole gypsy camp. And there must have been thousands of people. And I never worked in the cleaning up the sauna, but what happened was that they had people. They put some cyanide gas or something like that, and from the bottom, and people were trying to climb on top, on top of the other. From what I understand, it was just terrible. I've never seen it. I wasn't there, so I don't. But I can vouch for that stench. It was just, just unbearable, because the wind was bringing all this stench into the camp itself. So, and I would say they gassed at least a half of the people when we got off of the train. Then about, as I said, 3 days later, they gassed the gypsies. And there was always a smell, but it wasn't in that, like those two days, the first day and the third day was pretty bad. You still had that smell in the air, but it wasn't, they must have cut it down quite a bit by then. Okay. And about 2 days later, they marched us to a different camp, and we were strictly boys, probably not older than 16 or 17 years old. And we were fed unfit food, but we were hungry. I mean, I think we would have eaten wood and nails at that time. And we spent a night or two in there working on disassembling some barracks that on the other side of the camp that I don't know why they were taking them apart, but they were taking these barracks apart. And this was the second day. We were there on only about 2 days on that. Then the third or fourth day, we were cleaning up. We were marched to another camp, which I later learned that was a gypsy camp, and they gassed the entire gypsy population the day before. And I remember I was hungry, and we worked in the kitchen, and I had some pea soup that was practically frozen. And I think we have devoured that pea soup, that was frozen. I mean, it was solid. And then, about 2 days later, we were called, at the barrack, we were called to attention. And we were lined up in the barrack. And there must have been about 300 boys. Nobody was any older than about 16 or 17, I would say. And a German officer came in with 3 or 4, maybe 5 soldiers. And they just went and say, you. They got about 50 or 60 boys from this lineup. And no big deal. They loaded us up on a truck, big truck, and with 2 or 3 trucks, and open truck with a soldier with a gun, and we were driven away. We were driven away to a small camp called Furstengrube, which means first mine, loosely translated. And it was a coal mining complex, and altogether there was only about 12, maybe 1,300 prisoners in this particular camp, and we were to work in a coal mine. And as you walked into the camp, on the left-hand side there were Russian prisoners of war, and on the other side of the railroad track there were Italian prisoners that were not they were not prisoners. They just refused to fight, and they were free. I mean, they could come and go whenever they wanted. They didn't work, and some of the Russian prisoners of war didn't work either. But we had to work. The Furstengrube camp, actually the one that we started, it was clean. It was clean. We built a lot of it by stealing bricks from the coal mine, under supervision, of course. But we had showers every day that you came back from the mine. You went into the showers, and you scrubbed and you scrubbed, and if you were dirty, you got whipped for it. You got 15, 20 strokes. Go back and do it again. I mean, and it's tough when you don't have good soap, you know. And so, but the head was shaven, really cropped, you know, close. I mean, and the coal dust would get in there, and it would be really tough to keep it clean. But it was the cleanest it could possibly be. And then, after about 2 months, now we're going into the early part of January, we could hear the guns from a distance. The Russians were coming. And in the late part of January, 29th seemed to be in my mind. We were working a regular shift, and they cut the shift short. They marched us back into the camp. They fed us good soup for the first time in about 2 months. Actually, you could see some meat in the soup. Gave us a load of bread and said, "Be ready. Be ready for what? I don't know." We didn't know then. We're marching. We started marching in the evening. It was dark when we started marching. So we didn't know where we were marching. We could hear the guns. We could see the flashes of the guns in the distance, and they must have been heavy guns because it was quite a ways. One of the friends got injured in the coal mine, and he hurt his leg pretty bad, and it developed into gangrene. He was in a hospital when we were marching, and we started to march, and they were going to leave them there until they would get freed from the Russians when the Russians came. Well, apparently there was a change of orders, and this guy and 2 or 3 others ran away from the camp, and the gangrene got so bad that when the Russians got to him, he was a kid of 14, 15 years old, had to cut his leg off, and in order to keep him alive. So this was one of the sad stories up there. But it was winter. It was January. Snow was on the ground. It's been on the ground for quite some time, and they just lined us up and we marched. And I believe, I don't know the exact number, but I believe it was 1,280 male prisoners, and not all Jews. There were poachers, German poachers. That was a drastic crime. There were homosexuals. The Lagerkapo, which was the second in charge of the prisoners, of the prisoner himself, was actually a German that was fighting in Spain, the Spanish Revolution. The march was to get away from the Russians, because the Russians were coming. But the way that they treated the Russian prisoners of war and the Russians, what they did to Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, all of those countries, they knew that if they came in and came closer to the American lines, that they would be much safer than they would be with the Russians, which I don't blame them for, because this is self-protection. So, I believe it was 1,280 men that started, and the following morning there must have been 30, 40 dead. I mean, just exhausted, just collapsed and died right there and then, or collapsed anyhow. And by the time we came to Gleiwitz, more than half were dead. It was some people call it a 7-day march. I believe it was more like 5. But when we finally got into Gleiwitz, we were completely exhausted. We had no food, only that loaf of bread. We had no water, just regular clothing. We didn't have a coat. We just had a prison suit, wooden fabric. I mean, it wasn't woolen or anything like that. And as soon as somebody died, as soon as he was dead, they picked up the clothes and put them on. To at least get something to warm up, to keep somewhat warm. And as I said, these prisoners, they were dropping by the side. Even the German soldiers were dropping. Except the German soldiers, they were picked up. And after the second day, I think that these prisoners got smart and started dropping. But then the Germans came and started shooting them. And, just one shot to the head, right there on the ground. And today, it's a little over 50 years past that time. I doubt, very, very strongly, I doubt that there are more than a dozen men and prisoners from that camp alive today. These marches, they were coming from all parts of Poland. They were coming from the Warsaw region and western Poland, going into and they were going through Moravia, Bohemia, and Austria, and into Germany, Bavaria, and up to Germany. We stayed. I mean, we had to wait for the other trains to clear and all that. The track to clear, and this boy asked the soldier, and he says, "Could I come down and pick up some snow? I mean, we haven't had anything to drink in days." He said, "Yeah, come on down." So the guy goes down, picks up a handful of snow and puts it into his mouth, and this German shoves him and says, "You run." He says, "I'm not running." He says, "You run." He says, "I'm not running." So he pushed him away and shot him right into the face, right here, and came out the other side. The guy just dropped dead right there and then. He didn't want to go, but these Germans, they were so high-strung by this time. Nobody else came down. After these guys, I ran away. I ran away in Moravia because we came into a town called Olmutz, and people were waving at us and throwing food like from here across the street, which would be what, 50 yards, 100 yards. They would throw a loaf of bread out of the window, hoping that we could catch it. How can we catch it? It just wound up there for the pigeons or something. So we knew that we were in a more friendly environment. But then the couple of days, no, a day later, I ran away. We jumped the train, me and another friend. I was noticed. What happened was they were tossing the frozen people off of the train. It was open. It was an open, like a coal wagon, and there were 75 men to one of these wagons. And when they were tossing the dead people out, I jumped, pretending to be dead. And this guy jumped too. Now, I don't know, the train might have had 50 wagons. And it wasn't traveling really fast. But I tell you, it was the longest half a minute in my whole entire life before the train went by, because they were still shooting. They were still shooting these guys that were tossed. But I got so close to the train where they couldn't see me too well. And it was dark too, so that helped. And then we stopped at a little village, which was right around the corner. And the first thing we saw was a German truck with a bunch of soldiers coming out. We ducked right back into the alley. And finally made it to Brünn. And unfortunately, none of us had looked too clean. We got some clothes from a railroad worker and his family, but they couldn't actually shelter us. They just told us which way to go, and we got into this little town, and they already knew that we were coming, and they put us in with the workers, so we kind of blended in, and we got into, the railroads were kind of bombed, so they had to reroute and all that, and they were working for the railroads, so we got into Berlin, and he said, well, take the streetcar as fast as you can out of the middle of the town. We stopped at the main Bahnhof, railroad station, train station, right. And, well, it was a small square, I tried to stay in the shade as much as I could, and bought a newspaper. These people gave us some money, and this friend of mine, he was really hungry, so he walked into a store and got a loaf of bread, one of those real large ones, and put it under his arm. And I was sick. I had pneumonia at the time, which I didn't know I had pneumonia. But I was smart enough to get a newspaper, and as the entrance, we had entrance on one side and the front and the rear. So I got my newspaper, bought my ticket, and went and sat down in the middle of this train or tram. And this guy, unfortunately, was dumb enough to stand in the doorway. And we went 2 stops and some German soldiers were coming onto this streetcar, and the German, I saw him looking up at my friend up there, looked at him, grabbed him by the collar, dragged him down, and that was the last I saw of him. And I don't even remember his name anymore. I got off of the train on the next stop, and I was walking, and there was a big truck coming, and I waved it down. And there was two drivers, or two guys. They said, "Come on in." And he says, "You're running away from the concentration camp, don't you?" I said, "Yeah." "You check." He says, "Well, we can't take you too far, but we'll take you there. And you go and see this guy, and he will shelter you for a day or two." I did. He did. Send me on to the next village. Send me on to the next village. Well, finally, I got onto another train. And this time, I was heading for Prague. So I did buy a ticket. And it was a second-class ticket. And I'm on this train, and I'm walking by one of the doors, and it's open, so I walked in and sat down. I thought I was there by myself. A few minutes later, a lady comes in, sits across from me, starts talking to me. I says, "Where were you from?" I says, "Well, I'm from Prague. And I'm returning to Prague because I was in Katowice, and my house where I lived was bombed out." She says, "I lived in Katowice too." She said, "I'm going, and my house was bombed out also." So we started talking, and she offered me an apple, and we just kept talking. And probably, maybe an hour or so, maybe 2 hours later, a German control comes in. Well, I have learned earlier that when you do something wrong, you don't run away from it. You work against it. So I sat there talking. So the lady showed her documents, her passport, he salutes. He says, "How about you?" I says, "Well," I says, "I'm going back to Prague. That's my hometown." I said, "I come from Katowice, Poland. I worked on a coal mine, and my house got bombed. All my documents, all my clothes, all my belongings are gone." And the guy said, likely story. And the lady spoke up for me. She says, "I know this man. I know him from Katowice. He lives just around the corner from where I lived. And true, his house was bombed out." And she happened to be the wife of a colonel in the German army. And he says, "Besides," he says, "my husband knows him too." And he says, "You vouch for him?" She says, "Of course." He saluted and just walked right out. So the German lady actually saved my life. So when I got home to Prague, I went home to where we lived. I rang the doorbell. My mother opens the door. She looks at me, and she's just about ready to faint. I had to hold her up. Dzičku, like that, and her knees buckled, and I picked her up and walked her in. And she knew that, of course, that I was on the way, and I said, you know, I can't stay here. I didn't realize that they couldn't possibly keep a track of me because there were so many people. So I stayed. She took me to a place we were friends of the family, and they owned a coffee house, big coffee house, and a restaurant, and a buffet, and a little beer hall. And I stayed in this complex, which also housed a cinema. And I had a small little corner there, and I stayed there for about 2 weeks. And then I stayed with a family, a gentleman, he was a wagon driver. He drove horses for a living, and his wife, and they had 2 daughters. They were, I don't know if they were married or not, but she had a daughter and he had a daughter. They all lived in this house, and then they had a daughter together. The daughter was just a baby, about a year and a half or 2 years old, and the other girls were about 17 and 19 or so. After about a month with these people, we realized that I could come back and stay at home. So about a month later, this was from February, March, April. The 5th, they were already taking the German signs down, like if it was a store of any kind, it had to be in German and in Czech. And they started taking those German names down, like like a little grocery store. The German name would be taken off or painted over. And there was occasional shooting still till about the 13th or 14th, but it was very isolated. And you know, by then it was over. Just a few Germans were hiding someplace. But, the war was over by then. This train went all the way down to Bergen-Belsen, and as the war was ending, some ships to pick these people up, and it was painted with the Red Cross. These boats were painted with the Red Cross, and they got bombed, and quite a few guys have lost life there and there.
Now, your mother was an American citizen, correct?
No, she was not. She grew up here. She came to the United States when she was 9 years old, 11 years old, and she went through schools here, got married here. I have an older sister that was born here, came to the United States in 1941, and stayed with Grandma in Burbank, in Hollywood, in Southern California, and got married, and we actually get on real well now, much better than we did when we were kids. That's another story. And yeah, we hear from each other at least 2-3 times a month. So she doesn't call, I call her. So we also had a younger brother who passed away of a heart attack a few years back. He was the baby.
Alf, do you think that the general population at large was aware that the Jewish people were being exterminated? Or was it just, was there some kind of self-denial there, or do you think they were aware?
I don't think that they were aware of it to the extent that it happened.
There's always been discrimination of some kind or another throughout history. Do you think this was anything different? Do you think the Nazi...
Okay, let's go back to King James of England. He borrowed money from the Jews. He couldn't pay them. He sent them out. Queen Isabel of Spain. You either become a Christian or go out. Get out. The Germans did it more. They took everything they possibly could. First they took your possessions. And then they took your freedom. And then they tried to take your soul. And the Jews were enslaved in the days of Moses and Aaron, and they survived. The Jews are the strongest possible, mentally empowered people, I guess.